One of the questions that a lot of people ask me is, where is the blue ocean? Where are the blue ocean comic books that I should be picking up? What are those books that might be underappreciated and might actually have some potential to increase in value? Those are the questions that I get from people, and in this video, I am going to attempt to highlight 2 books that you may want to look into. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I want to encourage you to go ahead and do so now, because that way you won't miss out on any of the content that gets released from the channel, which includes helpful videos like this one. Stay tuned. Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. In this video, I am going to attempt to highlight 2 comics that you may want to research and potentially add to your comic book collection because they represent blue ocean opportunities. If you are unfamiliar with a blue ocean book, it is essentially a comic that might be underappreciated for several different reasons. Maybe people aren't paying attention to this book. Maybe this is a book that is just undervalued and has some things that are going for it that could, if the wind blows in the right direction, result in these books actually being worth a couple of extra bucks. Now, what I will tell you is that you should take some time to evaluate the things that I am saying in this video and decide for yourself whether what I'm saying makes sense and whether this is something that you actually want to do. Independent research is important. But what I will do in this video is highlight for you 2 books that I think are blue ocean opportunities. I'm going to explain why I think that these are good books, and then I'm also going to make some recommendations for maybe where you might want to invest based upon some market data. And again, the rationale that I provide is something you definitely want to scrutinize and think about for yourself. With that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the first book. And that book is Ghost Rider, issue number 28. Now, this is a pretty awesome book from the 90s. And this book is cool because it is the cameo appearance of the Midnight Suns. And it is also the first appearance of a couple of characters, including the Caretaker and Lilith. Now, why do I think that this is a book that is worthy of you doing some research and possibly even picking up? I say that this book is one that should be on your radar because Blade is coming to the MCU. There is no doubt about that Blade is going to be coming. They're going to be reigniting that fantastic series and character. So I'm definitely excited about that. But because Blade is coming to the MCU, it actually opens up the possibility that we could get some other types of horror-related characters pulled into the MCU to round out Blade's world. Because if you think about it right now, the MCU is very shiny and bright. It is not dark. It is not horror. And so how are they going to build this underworld, this dark world that Blade is going to operate in? The only way to do it is to fill it up with some horror-related characters. And so the Midnight Suns is a team that Blade was actually a part of back in the day. And so in addition to Blade, what you actually get are several other characters, including Morbius and a couple of Ghost Riders, including Danny Ketch and Johnny Blaze. And depending upon which version of the Midnight Suns you get, you also get Doctor Strange, the very Doctor Strange that is already in the MCU. And so again, by having Blade, by having Doctor Strange, it starts to paint a picture of maybe the Midnight Suns will be introduced as well. So if you were not around in the 90s when the Midnight Suns actually dropped, this was actually sort of a big deal. This was an imprint of Marvel and it was basically a whole world that was being created. And if you look at some of the comics from this imprint, there was actually a Midnight Suns dagger that was placed on comics that were tied to the Midnight Suns. Ultimately, the imprint failed, but the point is that back in the day, this was a pretty big deal. I recently tried to read this book, and I will tell you that it's not a good read. It really isn't a good read, and I kind of sort of know why it failed, but there was a lot of bad stuff that has been done back in the day that could be made awesome in the present day with the right writer or creators or directors or producers or whatever it is. And so the Midnight Suns could be a pretty solid play. While we're at it, I probably should mention that the full appearance of the Midnight Sun was issue number 31, and the cameo, of course, was issue number 28. But when you look at the values, which is the next thing that we're going to do for these two books, there is definitely an emphasis on the cameo appearance of the Midnight Suns. And so in many ways, you could lump these two books together and buy both to make sure that you're covering your bases. But if you had to buy one, you may want to prioritize issue number 28 versus issue number 31. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and look at some of the sales data. When you dig into the data, what you find is that a 9.8 of Ghost Rider issue number 28 has an FMV of $100. And honestly, the sales are pretty close to the FMV. I mean, they are really in the ballpark of $100, which is not necessarily a bad thing because $100 isn't a bad price to pay for a 9.8. When I looked at the CGC census, what I found was that there are roughly 300 copies of Ghost Rider issue number 28 on the census. And I think that this low number is really reflective of the low value associated with this comic. Again, at $100, if you consider cleaning, pressing, grading, shipping, there's not a whole lot of profit in this book. And so in my head, I think that there are a lot more of these books that are out there. And so in my opinion, you may want to go with a 9.8. If you decide that you don't want to do a 9.8, there are lots of other books that are raw that are out there that you could potentially pick up. You might actually be able to still find this book in the dollar bin. Now, with all of that said, I am honestly keeping my fingers crossed that we are going to see the Midnight Suns come to the Blade universe at some point down the road. But right now, it is still very much an open field. We don't know much about the Blade movie at all. But again, Midnight Suns was kind of a big deal back in the day, and so we could see them on the screen. The next book that I want to talk about is Eternals issue number 12. And this is volume 1. This is the Jack Kirby Eternals issue number 12. Now, this is the first appearance of something called the Unimind. And there is a chance that you have never heard this term before, but because I am a fan of Jack Kirby and the Eternals, this is one that has been on my mind, pardon the pun, for quite some time. The Unimind is essentially a telepathic melding of all of the Eternals. Like they literally come together and they give up their bodies and they coalesce into the Unimind. And I think that this happens in like times of crisis for them to overcome some major obstacle or something like that. So it's definitely an obscure thing, but it is again an interesting thing. And it's interesting to me because as you guys know, there is an Eternals movie that is on the horizon. And based upon some things that I have read and heard, it seems like the movie is really going to be focused on internal conflict within the Eternals society itself. And I'm guessing that that is going to pull in the Deviants and may also involve the Celestials as well. And so because it is going to be internal conflict within the society, in my mind, that leads me to believe that potentially the Unimind could appear on the screen. The other thing, if you think about it, is that there is typically several moments of authenticity to the Marvel movies that come out. There are a lot of things that they do for the general public where they change history, they do things slightly different to ensure that the movie can be enjoyed by a broad set of people, which makes sense. But oftentimes within these movies, there are moments, very authentic moments that resonate with comic book collectors and comic book readers. And in my mind, the Unimind could potentially be one of those powerful moments that when it happens, those fans of Jack Kirby, those true fans of the Eternals will appreciate. They will lean back in their chair and have that moment where they're like, this movie is official. And I will tell you that the Unimind, I don't think, or Eternals issue number 12 is not one of those comics that is going to blow up in value. I really do not think that that's going to happen. But this is a really cool thing and a really cool book to have in your collection if you believe in the Eternals, if you believe in what is happening with Jack Kirby, and you believe that there's some potential here. So I definitely want to encourage you to consider this one, to think about it. But again, I don't think anyone's going to be paying for college based upon the performance of this book. Because we're on the topic of money, we might as well dig into some of the sales data. Collect. What I found is that this book at a 9.8 has an FMV of $270. While comics are actually selling for less than the FMV, this book is pretty expensive at a 9.8. $300 or $270 is not a lot of money, but for this book, given what potentially will happen with this book, I feel that $200, $270 is too much money to spend. So in this case, I do not recommend getting the 9.8 unless you are just a die-hard Jack Kirby fan. On the Eternals, I do not recommend the 9.8. Instead, what you could do is actually go down to a 9.6. The FMV for a 9.6 of this book is sitting at roughly $100. To make it even better, books are actually selling for less than the FMV. And a 9.6 is not a bad grade for a book of this age. It is not a bad way to go at all. The other thing that you can do is to pick up some raw copies of this book. I actually have 2 copies of Eternals issue number 12 in my collection and have had them for a few years. I do not have a graded copy. I think that my copies could come back that high. But again, I like to provide you guys with all of the information so that you can make some more informed decisions about how and where and if you want to pick these books up. With that said, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, I certainly want to encourage you to hit the thumbs up button and leave a comment behind so we can mix it up in the comment section. If you enjoyed this video, if you truly enjoyed this video, there are other types of these videos here on the channel that you can check out as well. And if you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Instagram at Regie Collects.